Educational Video Series, where we talk about Kenpo, principles, motion, techniques, theories, concepts, etc., etc. We're always happy to see the participants here. We always encourage everybody to come on. This is sort of an open forum, and we discuss Kenpo in different facets. Sometimes it's an interview with a Hall of Fame member, which is very important, or we'll talk about Kenpo, the art of forms, where we discuss and break down Kenpo, and we look at the forms and the relative teachings that we have from it, what's the purpose of it, and such. And then we talk about a little more esoteric subject, which is where Mr. Parker was going, and that is called the art of war, Kenpo style. So today, I'm going to reference 3 publications. They are Mr. Parker's The Zen of Kenpo, Meaningful Quotes from the Teachings of Ed Parker. All right, that's first. That's about 50 years ago, maybe less. The second one is the Book of 5 Rings with Miyamoto Musashi, one of the greatest swordsmen in his thoughts and training. And finally, the last one that's from 2,500 years ago, which is probably a required reading assignment when you're in any kind of business school or military institution, called The Art of War by Sun Tzu. So let me start with these, and I'll start with this, and I'm going to lay a foundation so we can talk about it. So for today, Mr. Parker talks about, on page 15 of his book, he said, combat wisdom, which I'm going to read from it. He said, what is truth for one may not be truth for another. The real truth for both lies in the moment of actual combat. So that is the truth, is the moment of actual combat. And then, as we had last time, to hear is to doubt, to see is to be deceived, but to feel is to believe. So that's our basic premise from Mr. Parker. Being concerned and asking the right questions and making sure you have a plan so that when you're confronted with the situation, through all your training, you'll be able to have the proper response. In other words, the proper response is based on the attack that is coming at you. So with that, let's go to the second publication. And that one is from Mr. Musashi. And it's here. And he says in this, which is important, he says, the Book of Fire describes the importance of knowing the difference between using a bamboo practice sword and a real sword in combat. So the difference. So you're in the studio with Mr. White, Mr. Conatser, Mr. Farnsworth, with Derek Hibben, Todd Durgan, Greg Hildebrandt, Chuck Howe. There's one thing to practice with these things, folks. What happens to the true moment of truth? That's the relationship to the last quote by Mr. Parker. Okay? Finally, the last quote I'm going to give you is from Sun Tzu. Okay? And he says, he who knows these things and in fighting puts his knowledge into practice will win his battles. He who knows them not, nor practices them, will surely be defeated. So think of the 3 quotes I just gave you, and let's talk about that real quick. And I'm going to go to the seniors on this because you guys are the people we look to with great respect and honor because you've earned it. And you have a world of experience, both as competitors and now as teachers, in trying to guide the young martial artists and even the seasonal martial arts to remember the important things like that. So with no further ado, I'm going to go to Mr. Bob White and ask him to comment on this, on strategy. Mr. White, welcome to the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame Educational Video Series. What are your thoughts?
All 3 books are of great value. I think there's some tremendous things. I quote Musashi often, and when he talks about somebody's defense is at their weakest point when they're thinking offense. So we talk about being very selective and the importance, if possible, of de-escalation. There's another book that I'll draw from real quick from Captain Ron Sanchez. And he talks about if it's not worth dying over, it's not worth fighting over. And I think that idea of avoidance is what we want to do. If it has to get to the physical level, of course, develop your strategies, and which are really enforced in all of those books. There's things to learn and grow from and help shape the style that you need to implement against a particular fighter. All self-defense techniques in all forms are counters. You're defending against somebody attacking you. What most people have the hardest time is the entry techniques, where in some cases, our best defense is our offensive skills, especially when you're fighting more than one person. So I think adjusting, have the tools, the knowledge to adjust to the various attacks that you might come under and the different situations that you might come under. But those are great books. I think you chose wisely. I look forward to hearing input from the people throughout the day, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. White, and I appreciate your time here with us today is going to be limited, but that's okay. I want to ask you some questions that are relative to what you just said. So you have a young student come in. He's learning to protect himself in self-defense. You guide him on it through drills, I'm guessing, to improve his skills so he can respond. Obviously, Mr. Parker addresses that in the 3 divisions of the art. The first one, most important, are basics. Basics. And I've mentioned that before when he took over a class for me in Pasadena, talking about the secrets of Kenpo Karate. How do you help the student to understand that these drills are to be used only when an appropriate response is attacked? In other words, somebody's attacking you. How do you help them? Because they're going to go to that fighting mindset. And how do they understand that, where they should be with it?
Well, we know that emotion's the enemy. Well, your emotion is your ego, your anger, some cases too much elation. So learning to control emotions, that's why it's so great at a good karate studio where respect is reinforced all the time. You learn to bow on and off the mat, the respect toward the teacher, but also the teacher's respect to the student. And that respect, I think, gives people a sense of environment. They're more likely to control their emotions and less likely to get into a confrontation. And if at all possible, that de-escalation could be implemented. So a lot of it is developing the presence of mind and being comfortable enough with yourself that you don't feel you have to do anything other than control yourself.
Let's go over to Chuck Howell. And Chuck, how you devoid yourself, sir? How do you devoid yourself of the emotional aspect when you're training?
Yeah, training, it's, you know, when it gets real, you got to, you know, you need the actual force to be able to feel it, to know the actual feelings. And that, because it's those feelings that can trigger responses. And it's practice. I practice that to learn what the responses are, to learn myself, to predict those responses coming, then I'm more able to control.
Going right over to Todd Durgan. Todd, how are you, sir? Welcome to the program. How do I distinguish between the bamboo sword and the real sword?
Well, hopefully it's not through getting cut too many times. But the lessons are learned, you know, in the old days, the lessons were learned through pain. You know, drills create skills, as Mr. White has said many times. And I know that he has a great many drills that he uses. If you look at systems like Kali Arnis, Screama, I mean, any system of martial arts has a foundation of drills that they use for creating confidence or building confidence and encouragement in the student. And those drills, you know, the more a student practices them with somebody else and on somebody else, you know, or has interactive, you know, the more they're going to understand the reality of what's happening, and they're going to be able to, you know, be in a frame of mind, or, you know, be able to use those skills that they've developed through the drills that they've practiced and done. I mean, if we look at techniques and forms and sets and all those, they're just drills. They're, you know, if you're doing them in the air, they're drills to practice your basics and solidify what you have. If you're doing them with somebody or on somebody, or they're doing them on you, that's to solidify the interaction and the physicality of what's happening, and to start to create that synaptic response, and that you know, all of those things that happen in a combative and emotional situation, whether you have anger, you know, sadness, or whatever the case may be.
Going to Dennis Conatser. Dennis, welcome to the show. How do you distinguish between that bamboo sword and the real sword, and how do you teach the student to respond without emotion?
I mean, there's numerous ideas on that. I look at it as the bamboo sword is like teaching. It's your training grounds, you know, and the real sword is the reality. You know, if you make the wrong move with a real sword, you may not be around the next day to work with a bamboo sword. You know, so you know, your teaching versus reality is kind of my take on that. And like Mr. White, I agree that I think one of the great attributes today that's missed oftentimes is respect, in and out of the studio, toward each other, toward the student, toward the instructor, and toward just people in general in life. And I think that's a bad thing, you know. Like Todd reiterated too, in terms of training, a lot of these things, a term that I came up with was drills, or all the stuff between white and black are drills to develop skills. They're not absolutes, they're just ideas, and they're you know, you don't need to do 5 swords on the street. I asked Mr. Parker once, I said, "You're gonna do 5 swords on the street ever?" And he goes, "Probably not." And he said, "That's not the point of 5 swords. It's a drill to teach you how to move, and the same thing with all the rest of them as well. And if you do them enough times, you're going to become a creature of habit, and you put those into practice, and those are going to be your fundamental foundations of the way you react and move. And too often, too many people get hooked up into practicing techniques only and never work against a live opponent that's not cooperating with you. And so sometimes you need to work with you know, freestyle and other things to you know, technique lines as an example. Most people do technique lines where you're with an opponent that's you know, complying with whatever you're doing and trying to teach, which is okay. But there's also, what about a technique line that's non-compliant? You know, and that's what's going to really see how much you've learned from the drills. So you know, you go from walking and thinking and practicing and theorizing into reality, and without the reality, we're cutting short.
Derek Hibben, you have a lot of experience with the reality of a knife and what a knife will do, especially if it's a Hibben knife when you're making them. I bet you have some personal experience of not touching the blade in the wrong spot. So how do you work with the reality of a practice versus a real deal situation? How do you do that, and how do you help the student understand the difference?
I think a big difference is obviously through basics, kind of the rule of 10,000 when it comes to practice. Other arts that I've studied, you probably heard me say it before, as I've always been taught: learn the drill, forget the drill. That way it becomes muscle memory. You don't have to think. There's always going to be some level of emotion, and our job is to learn to control it and turn those emotions into senses. I came from the old school of feeling is believing. And when it comes to teaching students, I think it's very, very important to pass along what we've learned in real life situations and not give them a false sense of hope or protection, or that they just learned this technique and now they think they can walk out on the street and handle themselves when they've never been put in a real life situation. I think a big part of the training comes into taking the gi off and stepping onto the street and putting on real clothes. and not training with someone that's compliant. A lot of the bouncers, law enforcement, even military guys that I've worked out with and trained over the years, they don't know our system, and they're not going to come and go quietly. So when they ask me to come in and demonstrate or teach them or show them some things, there's not one guy in the room that knows what I'm trying to teach him or show him. I have to make the guy move. And if he doesn't move, I have to be a little bit more aggressive in my movement. But I think in the same token, when the emotion side comes into things, the more knowledge you have, the more merciful you can be also. So we have to play that in mind, where the bamboo sword meets the real sword. The bamboo sword comes in, okay, if this guy just coming to push me, am I going to break his neck and do all these different moves and all these? Like, absolutely not. I'm going to try to de-escalate the situation as best I can verbally. If I can't do so that way, and it comes down to flesh meets flesh, then I hope I'm the one walking away.
Okay, great. Let's go over to Jason. Jason, how are you, sir? You know, I made a quote here. If fighting will not result, it says basically you have to understand the difference between them. And if you don't practice them in accordance, what's going to happen? You will be defeated. So what I've heard now from 3 of our participants is to train with diligence, but devoiding yourself of emotion and understanding that your training is what's going to get you through that. How do you approach that when you work? How do you make sure that the training partner is sort of, instead of compliant, is not compliant? I mean, we're not going to physically get into it unless you're doing freestyling with some rules, but generally he's going to attack you. You want to feel some pressure. You want to pressure test this thing, so to speak.
Sure. I'm going to take a slightly different philosophical approach to your philosophical question here.
Okay.
When you're talking about the bamboo versus the live blade, being people in general, where you're in the studio practicing, say, the boken versus going out on the street practicing the live blade, if you will, the other gentleman being the live blade or people. Oftentimes, before the COVID happened, I actually have my students put gloves on, and we do our freestyle techniques with gloves on, pads on, and we also do our self-defense techniques as well. I try to have my adult class escalate that up to the point where, you know, you can take an actual hit, or also to greater deal with the people that I have with a little bit more experience. We put the Taekwondo chest protectors on and actually hit, so you can actually hit harder and feel a little bit more of a difference in it. Practicing that way, so that way you can understand that, hey, you know what, I can hit this guy so hard in a certain spot and the gentleman is still standing. Then you have to go from there. I actually use the freestyle as a catalyst to understand motion or put combinations together and you know, move from there. But the only way to actually practice the live blade is to actually get out on the floor and try it as best as you can, so you're more prepared in case the other person that is across from you, when you go to the grocery store or the restaurant, to be that prepared in time of need, or in case the need exists. And one thing I try to do with my junior level students, from whether they're 6 to 12 or 14 before they join my adult class, is to make sure that they understand why we put the scholar over the warrior, and to try to use your brain in your mouth to get out of it before you have to get into it at last resort. But even with them, before pre-COVID, we would put gloves on, and I would have them try to do their self-defense techniques with gloves on, and try to work through those, and see that sometimes these techniques work and sometimes they don't, depending on who's in front of you.
Jason, let's take the gloves off. All right.
Okay.
Metaphorically, have you ever trained with a Sharpie instead of a real knife?
I have. Many years ago, I have. I was surprised to see how well I didn't come out of that. So
bleeding all over, baby.
Yeah. So yes, I do understand that. And actually, I was doing some cleaning up the other day, and I actually found knives that have the training knives that have the chalk on the bottom, and I said, oh man, I'm going to take these in so we can try to use these later on to see how they work. I haven't got that far yet, but yeah, it's almost a necessity as well.
Let's go to Jamie. Hey, Jamie, how are you, sir? Your thoughts on what we've been discussing so far. How do you distinguish between the bamboo sword and the real sword in your training?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I am fortunate. I had the opportunity to grade for my black belt under Rainey. So we did a lot of stick and knife, and but I will say it's one thing to do the drills, and I think the drills are so important. Repetition, repetition, repetition. But you know, to think that fear won't completely kick in, I think is incorrect. You know, the drills we do, even though they're give and take, but like American Kenpo, there is a large part of it that is choreographed. I mean, we get some resistance when we're doing techniques with our partners, but for the last 8.5 years, it's actually been a good eye-opening experience. I've been studying Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and it's been very humbling for the reason that when we roll, everything that you learn, every single technique that you learn, you can try when you're rolling. And if you think of any technique in Kenpo, snapping twig, lone kimono, 5 swords, you know, again, you know, it's kind of easy to look good when we know what the attack is. That's my belief. So incorporating more spontaneity drills, and I think Dennis Conatser was getting at more sense of realism is just so important as we continue to move up the ranks.
Do you think we have a false sense of security with our techniques?
Yeah, I do. I especially do. I especially do for the I don't know what percent I can attribute this to, that predominantly practice techniques, forms, and sets with very little sparring. I know I listened to a few of your shows. I know Bob White said a lot about that with sparring. I couldn't agree more, because the sparring, you know, I mean, I fight with my black belts all the time, and you know, I mean, one particular guy, he was 8 when he started with me, is 29 now. So I mean, if I have a large pasta before, I'm going to take a few shots. But it's humbling, and the reality is it gives us a different feel, but sense of realism by incorporating the stand-up fighting with the techniques, and then incorporating some of the groundwork as well.
Do you ever take the gloves off and use like a Sharpie or something like that? Some kind of prop. I hate to say it, short of using a knife, because I hate thinking of just using a training knife.
Yeah, I have with my advanced
response.
I have with my advanced students, but I will say, you know, especially when I think of someone like Rainey, there was many times where I thought I was pretty good with a knife, and then I'm like, okay, I would have been dead. I got cut 45 times, and I've seen that with many people. You know, people coming in from different styles, Krav Maga, huge knife stick background, and you know, you do a couple drills, put some lipstick on the fake knife, and sure enough, their shirt is pure red. And the reason why I say that is that, you know, we can glancing lance and thrusting lance ourselves to death. This is my honest opinion, but you know, the best spot to be against a knife is not to be there, and to find a way just to get the heck out of there. That's my thought.
You know what? It's funny. I know a few knives that wear lipstick. Let's go to somebody else real quick on this and moving on with it. Let's get to so let's deal with the analytical study of motion. I believe if you look at, first of all, the infinite insights of Mr. Parker's writings, specifically, I was dealing with volume 5, but let's back it up. Okay, let's go to volume 1. And most of you might have these books or reference in your library. It might be something to read as an addition to what I just brought up. But Mr. Parker talks about the 3 divisions of the art. He talks about basics. There's first. Okay. He talks about basics. Then he talks about self-defense. Then he talks about freestyle. Now, I'm grabbing out one of my favorite books. Folks, if you've seen this one before, and if you didn't see this one, I'm going to put me back on because I'm right now here. Okay, here we go. This was my original training guide of all the Kenpo I wanted to know, yellow through green belt, 32 techniques per belt, and it broke it down. And in Mr. Parker's book here, this is long before, by the way, folks, before the Infinite Insight. So this is stuff from the 70s, maybe the 60s, but chances are it's probably the 70s. And in it, he had these little pamphlets, which he gave to us as students to learn from. And in it, if you broke it down, I want to lay a foundation is what I'm trying to do. If we were in a courthouse, I would be doing this, but I have to do all of it. So in it, it lays out what? It says the yellow belt basic fundamentals. It talks about yellow belt techniques. It talks about forms and freestyle. So the 3 divisions are here. All right? It says it. Then you look at that section that was given to our instructors. And if you look at it, Mr. Parker breaks it down. He says required teaching in the sequence of yellow belt techniques. Okay? And he gives you all of them. And this actually is funny because I had intellectual departure, which is one of my favorite techniques. It's a great freestyle technique if you can use it. And Frank liked that one as well. But it was removed and later and changed with, I think, sword and hammer. Anyway, below it in the typewriter has right here, it says categorical breakdown. I'll repeat that. Categorical breakdown. And then he takes and he breaks down the techniques into groupings. All right? So that part, he breaks them down for grabs, pushes, punches, kicks, hugs, locks, and weapons, which are divided also in our pamphlet that we got. Now, this is long before Infinite Insights comes out. So the categorical breakdown is put in there. Go to volume 1 in Kenpo. And we're here it is. I make sure I reference all this so nobody can question what my references are. And it lays it out for you in chapter 3. And he says that the basic self-defense and freestyle. Now, I referenced it earlier with Mr. White that Mr. Parker said the secrets of Kenpo karate. He was going to teach him one night. And I was like enthralled with that, but I knew something was coming. And so did the students. And he harped into us the basics. The drills, the techniques would come from there. And then eventually you could segue to your freestyle. Remember, most confrontation, the guy's just not going to just stand, square off on you. There's going to be some kind of confrontation for some reason. And I'll let you guys discuss it. We get to volume 5 of Mr. Parker's book. Infinite Insights. And in Infinite Insights, he lists this, the analytical study of motion. And he develops it into several ways. And one of the things that's under it as well, he calls it under the web of knowledge. And he references categories that way. And he talks about the categories. He says, I categorize the web into prime topics of concern and arrange the course in a manner that I considered progressive. The categories, he doesn't really say categories. He says, mostly I categorize the concern of the topics. And he puts in priority. And then again, he reiterates grabs, tackles, punches, pushes, kicks, holds, hugs, chokes, locks, weapons, multiple attacks, combination of the above. Then he gets into chapter 6, and he talks about the analytical study of motion. And he talks about direction, method, path, dimension, and angle. All right? I go this over very quickly. If you need to read it more, I suggest you read the book. Now I will go to Todd Durgan. Todd, explain that to us. Why is that essential to our study in Kenpo?
So the techniques are categorized by priority. And so one of the common themes nowadays for some people is talking about category completion. And
is Kenpo complete?
No.
Okay.
So
we'll break down the word. We'll break it down into 2 parts. Not to step on you, but I want to make sure I got it filtered. So the categories or the categorical breakdown is the first part. and how we examine it and learn it and expand on it is the second part. Correct?
Okay. Yep.
Okay, I just want to get an idea, and I'm going to have everybody here is going to jump in on this discussion. It's important to us. So go ahead, sir.
So, I mean, Mr. Parker, in his own words, I think it was page 284 of book 5 in his conclusion, talked about how he hopes that, you know, people will take what he's done and progress and move forward with it. You know, and you can utilize the main or the base system to do that, and then branch out from there. So the categories, you know, it's categories of technique attacks and by priority. Mr. Conatser and I have had actually many discussions on this.
Walk us through the 5.
So, okay, so it starts in yellow for example, with grabs and tackles, and it goes to pushes, punches, kicks, hugs and holds, locks and chokes, and then to weapons. Weapons being the most difficult to defend against, right? So they're prioritized by level of difficulty to defend against or to deal with, right? And in weapons is also, you know, is the clubs, knives, and, you know, pick another weapon. If there was an ice pick, I'm sure it would be in there. So grabs and tackles are close range, which is funny. To me, it's funny that it starts with grabs and tackles because most Kempoists are less comfortable at close range.
Why is that?
Because the majority of the techniques work at range. But that's true also of a lot of other martial artists. By the way, I have to say, Mr. Seabrook, it's great to see you on here. We've never met, but I've enjoyed some of your videos. I apologize.
Thanks, Todd.
So the category, and it's very important that we follow these categories and the web of knowledge with regards to the order of teaching these techniques, because they build, each has principles that build on the last and that set you up for the next category of techniques. Okay, so the grabs and tackles is an easier, less violent, I suppose, attack than, for example, a push or a punch. Okay, certainly than a kick or a, okay. Hugs and holds become those types of things that maybe a jiu-jitsu stylist might do or try and get, as well as locks and chokes. Okay, those hugs and holds can lead to very compromising positions, et cetera, et cetera. So it's when people reorganize the way they teach the system, a lot of times they do themselves and their students a disservice by changing the techniques out of the order of the web of knowledge, because Mr. Parker specifically, in my opinion, and remember this is all just my opinion, specifically arrange those to be progressive, right? But is the category complete? I don't think so.
Let me back it up for a second. You know, you started talking about we're well within the range, so we're at close proximity to one another. So what we're at that point, you're talking about contact, opponent in contact with you.
You're in the fourth stage of range. You're in the fourth stage of range.
He's exercised an intent of action to make contact with you. And then the farthest away is that he just giving you the intent that he may come at you in some way with either he's going to try to punch you, he's going to try to tackle you, or he's going to try to grab, choke you. Am I correct? Is that three ways of defining?
Correct. But then now you're getting into, how do I practice my techniques? I need to practice my techniques with a prefix to action, a right now technique where it's happened, and then a suffix to action after he's attacked. So, and the techniques in the different categories also address that, where we have, you know, the grab, we have pushes, for example. Let's say snapping twig. If we use this for a punch, you can teach that technique for a push, a punch, or a grab. Okay. Two of those are interim techniques where they're now attacking you but haven't laid hands on you yet. The third one with the grab is where they've somehow gotten in range, right, and made contact, and now they have a hold of you. So the threat has escalated.
Let me go to Dennis Conatser on this. Dennis, you and I have had conversations about this. Actually, we've had arguments about this. Disagreement, so to speak. Okay. And I will, Derek, don't laugh. You're coming in soon. Okay. So, Mr. Conatser, sir, you were there when Mr. Parker was writing these books with several other individuals. The talking about the analytical study of motion, walk us through those 5 areas that Mr. Parker defined and why they're important to our Kenpo knowledge. I'm thinking this addresses the dragon or the scholar side of Kenpo, because the material was already laid out for us previously through the teachings in the red books and things, the 154 techniques, extensions, forms, etc., sets, and whatever. We're now going past that and get into the mindset of the scholar and how we can develop and grow from it. Otherwise, we're finite, correct?
Well, you know, the saying on the patch is mastery comes when the dragon is seen, but the tiger is seen, but the dragon prevails, which means you need the book of knowledge, you need the hand of the warrior. So, you know, it actually entails both. The warrior has to be smart in his attack. Without strategy and such, many of wars have been fought and done poorly because of bad strategy. So I think we can go to almost any war for that.
We related that to the beginning of our discussion when I said that, you know, that if he that does not practice this or understand this will surely be defeated by Sun Tzu. So walk us through why these 5 areas is discussed under this category, so to speak, Mr. Parker's thinking under the analytical study of motion. Why are they important to us?
As we said them before, the 5 categories are direction, method, path, dimension, and angle. Direction being front, back, right, left, above, and below. So we need to consider numerous circumstances that we can you know, be affected by it. And then the first of all is direction. You know, front, back, right, left, above, and below. And then, of course, there's techniques for a lot of those. We don't have very many for above. We have a couple for below, but, you know, and that's where we need to still continue on and practice. Getting to what Todd said in terms of the web of knowledge, there's not so much difficulty on there. I'd have to figure out what his word difficulty is, but they're more or less of which, talking to Mr. Parker about that, it was more of grabs and tackles, pushes, punches, kicks. They're all progressive in a circle of danger. A grab is just a grab. It's not intended on hurting you, at least in the initial stage of the grab, you know, type thing. Whereas a push is more aggressive, a punch is even more aggressive. A hug or a hold is a possible death maneuver. You know, lock and choke can cause a broken arm or you know, whatever. And then, of course, weapons, you know, are extremely dangerous. So, you know, those are considerations that need to be put in our strategy in terms of direction, and that the techniques fall into different directions, and then we're shown how to potentially, you know, use a hypothetical situation to get out of some of these. There's certainly not all there is. That's why we have variable expansion, because there's certainly more than we have as a base for our system. Method is simply circular and linear. So most of our movements, when we start looking at motion, we're looking at 2 basic forms, circular and linear. And Mr. Parker said that when linear stops, circular begins, and when linear stops, circular begins, circular stops, linear reappear. So it's that combination of going from circular to linear throughout our techniques, and that can be with move to move. Path is the universal pattern, and Todd is great on that. I would defer to him to that because he's fantastic on the path, which gets into the universal pattern and the 9 planes and how things we can work with and react and maneuver within those planes and look at potential strikes and things that you might not have thought about before. Mr. Parker sometimes uses everyday motions in his explanation of some of our techniques and how our everyday motions can be used in self-defense. Direction, method, path, dimension. height, width, depth, and obscure,
Yeah.
obscurity. And
Which is rarely people think about that. They're never looking over their shoulder. There was a quote by Bruce Lee regarding obscurity. Why don't you talk about that just briefly?
well, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Which one?
His back against the wall. I'll go because he didn't have to worry about that. But I believe that took away an exit strategy for him by worrying about his back against the wall. That's just my personal take on it.
In talking on a forum that I'm working on right now, we're working on, it's a forum for two-man attacks. It's all our two-man attacks put together in one forum. And the thing is, talking to another individual about Bruce Lee's strategy, and he said when dealing with multiples, he would like to have his back against a wall because he only has to worry about one front. Well, the problem with that, like you say, is there's no exit. And I think if Bruce was here today, we could argue that point. And he doesn't, he talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. Because in most of his movies, he's never against a wall. He's always in the center,
Because that's for good cinematography. I think one of the elements of dimension, and Mr. White would probably understand this, and I stress this with my students because it's just common sense. It's called preparation. When I was going to college, if I did not give myself a proper time to research, study, and prepare for that examination, I had a problem. I had less chance to survive that exam and to go on to the next level. And I call that element of dimension, I think of it as the dimension of time. More time you have, the greater the distance. The greater the distance, more time. It sort of plays back and forth. Now, maybe that's not the place for it, but I always think of, this is the Twilight Zone or the Outer Limits. For those of you that ever watched that, you'll understand what I'm talking. So let's go with the last aspect of it, and let's talk about angle.
Well, the last one with angle is measure of degree. So
what does that mean?
The angle. Well, the angle. A lot of times we go with the universal pattern, and there's our basic 12, 6, 3, 9, 137, 30, 10, 30, 430 type thing, but there's degrees in between all of that. And I mean, you can shuffle forward typically to 12 o'clock, and in sparring, typically you go one way, but there's also off angling. Bob White knows a lot about that. I watched him teach, and he's brilliant. You got to off angle. You don't want to keep hitting head on all the time. If an opponent's coming at you straight in, off angle and take the technique like swinging pendulum, where Mr. Parker, learned to off angle and move what he says, move up the circle, and take a different angle, or measure of degree versus maybe just a standard one. So we have many, many angles to work from, and so there's, that's kind of the general definition of angle. And I'll refer to Todd right now to go ahead and answer.
I'm going to change gears on you. Thank you, Mr. Conatser. And instead, I'm going to Mr. White. Mr. White, how do you utilize the principle of angle as defined by Mr. Parker on the analytical study of motion?
Well, angle, of course, I also equate it to path, the avenue that you take to get to a particular target, or the angle enhancement to create a larger target. So it's certainly things that we learn in our self-defense technique. As the example, if you throw the same outward hand sword of lone kimono, and you do that same hand sword and sword and hammer, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't get to the target. But if you complement the angle and take a different path directly underneath the chin, you're going to be more effective to the throat, kind of with a Billy Jack outward hand sword, and then the hammer fist to the groin. It's going to work because your path is altered. A lot of people, as an example, have beautiful head kicks, but they come in at a 45-degree angle, and if they were fighting somebody, they would be taking the path directly through their hands, and they'd never get to the target. But somebody who had the ability to maybe roll their hip over a little bit, come in more horizontally, then their chances of success will be greatly enhanced. It's like being the only car on the freeway. You have nothing in your way, you're going to get to the target. So path and angle are so critical. I think there's a term, no, it's the zone. They call it zone of sanctuary. I always laughed at that because what other people would think as a zone of sanctuary. They haven't fought against some of the guys from our school. You're not in sanctuary at all. You're just another target, because they have the ability to throw hooking heels and create opportunity for themselves because of the path that they take or the angle that they're able to utilize. But all the techniques are so critical, and all 5 aspects that you mentioned are so important, because everybody, and I'm not saying anything that people don't already know. There's people of different physical attributes, personalities that have helped shape their style. And while somebody might want to really pounce more on the cerebral aspects of the art, other people want to talk about angle improvement or maybe some other aspect. And it doesn't mean that one's better than the other. It's just that different people have different styles. I would like to say real quick, it's good to see Jamie Seabrook in here, and also Jason in here. I always enjoyed watching him do his forms. I've seen it a couple of times on the internet, and enjoy. You've got some talented people here today, and I'm looking forward to growing and learning. I thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mr.
so
White.
much.
Jamie, address those 2 issues that he was talking about, Mr. White was talking about. Let's talk about angle and path and how that's relative technique. That is a structured response to an appropriate attack. However, that's not real life, folks. Now, a lot of people will do what, was earlier, as Todd was talking about. They're going to go to the easiest thing and grab you or try to choke you or try to tackle you. I mean, how many guys just square off and punch you? You got to be aware of your circumstance, which is what I talked about in the beginning. Awareness, okay? So address that 2 issues of angle and path.
Now, there's a couple things I'd say. We definitely learn angles and paths a lot in our techniques. Again, very choreographed, but we learn by doing them repetitively over and over on people how to get the correct angle and get the correct paths for our strikes. But to be honest, I also like what Bob White said. There's been many times where I was absolutely certain I was on a zone of sanctuary, and I took one off the head, didn't work too good. So with respect to path and angles, yeah, I mean they're all throughout our system everywhere. But getting, again, that sense of realism, working our techniques, they're all throughout, but also getting that sense of realism and doing our stand-up sparring and learning how it actually works. And as far as the categorization, I should say too, of grabs and tackles, and I always say this, I feel like sometimes in Kenpo we're like, grab me anywhere, I can get out of it. The way I teach my students is, if you're grabbed, I don't know, delayed sword, we were lucky that they happened to put our hands on us, because if we're all, as instructors here, under the belief system that we should keep 2 arm lengths away, or a leg and a half away in terms of range and distance, well, something didn't happen right, because they got their hands on us. So the fact that they got our hands on us meant that we obviously didn't follow that quote rule of keeping that distance. Something went wrong, and they just happened to put their hands on our throat or grab her hair or grab her wrist. But the reality, that could have been a poke to the eye, or even worse, a knife right to the gut. You know what I mean? So I always try to, these are the techniques in the ideal phase, but the reality is we want to keep that distance and have distance management.
Jamie, when you're talking with these students, most of them are unfamiliar with fighting because they've never had any experience with fighting. Now, You've had experience with it, so you understand. And I'm going back to the intent to commit contact, action of making contact, and finally making contact. Now, how you want to define that, I don't care. I'm not going to get caught up in terminology.
Yep.
A punch is still a punch in English, German, Chinese, or sign language. Okay? That's the bottom line, folks. So don't put labels on stuff unless you understand completely. And just because you don't use Japanese, Chinese, or sign language doesn't mean you can't understand. So it's easy. If I stand off at you and I raise my hands, you're going to instantly be kicked in to the idea, why is his hands coming up, and is he within my zone? All right? Yeah, that's when you start to go, oh, hold on, pal. And you start to
Yeah, and you know,
time thing,
you're right, Paul. And you know, I make a joke about this when I teach my students, but I say this is the international sign of surrender. You can go anywhere on the globe, but if the hands are, hey, I don't want to fight, I surrender. But as Kenpoists, it's also the international sign for I'm ready, right? Because our hands are in an optimal position. But I think it's also the approach. I mean, you know, in terms of level of contact, I'm not a big believer in jumping in and doing full contact early. That's how you get people to leave your school and never want to come back. And people have short careers. I mean, people in MMA, I know several of them who you know, to be honest, some even fought in the UFC. You know, they've had concussion after concussion after concussion because everything is full contact, and they're young. And I think I can speak for everyone here. I want to be 95 and still doing Kenpo if God allows me.
Yeah, even from a chair here. You know, when in the opening discussion, I brought in the references to the three people: Mr. Parker, Miyamoto Musashi, and Sun Tzu. And in Sun Tzu, I was talking, or excuse me, in the Book of Rings, a Book of Fire.
Right.
He said the difference of practicing between a bamboo sword and a real sword. Okay, we have to understand that. So the thing is you put your hands up, that also might give a signal to an aggressive opponent that says, you know what? That's my signal. I'm going to attack him, which is his mistake. And if he does that, then we go to Todd Durgan and we say, Todd, talk to us about the angles. Let's talk about path and angles that you discuss in your publications.
So the measure of angle is just gets into your finite directional action, your finite direction of action. Also, just real quick, I wanted to touch on obscure. I think that obscure actually belongs in direction. It's not actually a dimension. You don't have an obscure dimension. Height, depth, and width covers dimension. Of your obscure zone or obscure zones is a place or a direction that somebody will come into or from. Does that make sense?
I'm trying to vision that. Yes, I can understand where you're coming from. That's
just my opinion.
Always be aware of what's behind you first.
Which is covered in the front, back, right side, left side, above, etc. Right?
Exactly. If you go to the book, if we look at, you're talking about that in Mr. Parker's book here. When you look at the analytical study of motion, and you're referencing between pages 90, which 90 has it right there laid out back in front. And then it keeps on going and then he puts it all together. So continue, sir. Path
also should include, and it's funny because I had a conversation with one of the gentlemen a while back, and he said that had made a comment about Mr. Parker not caring too much about physics. And in page 101, I believe it is, page 101, he talks about physics and techniques, et cetera, et cetera. But the difference and differentiating between a path and a line of attack is very important because one is wider than the other, and one can be certainly more obscure or concealed than another. So just a small variance, but so in the universal pattern, or if you're using the universal pattern to recognize and teach angles and lines and paths of motion and action, then
Mr. Durgan I'm going to interrupt him for just a second. Mr. Durgan created this amazing tool here. Is a three-dimensional version of the universal pattern, and there's two of them I have. This one is completely 360, and the other one is cut in half, and you can go from there. If you're interested in that stuff, give Todd a call or write to him. It's a brilliant teaching tool. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. And by the way, Todd, on that comment from Mr. Parker that you were talking about, on page, as you had it here, 101, he says the concepts of width zones, height zones, depth zones, obscure zones are welcome studies, subjects of study. So Mr. Durgan, please go ahead and continue on. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So I'm not sure where I got lost at, but so the universal pattern teaches the angles, the 8 basic angles of attack. if you look at your universal patch that most Kenpoists wear on their shoulder, it has the, the flat pattern with the 8 basic angles of attack, and then your angles are just more finite directions based or moving off of those. Instead of 45, it's 22.5, it's 90 degrees, or it's 11 degrees, or it's whatever. Most martial systems reference angles by degree, or to traditionally. Ed Parker's Kenpo is probably one of the singular systems that utilizes and references the clock principle. So we can utilize the clock principle in conjunction with the angles or degrees of angle.
Can you walk us through the planes?
So one of the things that I did do, and I apologize for the washing machine spinning behind me. Hopefully you can't hear that. One of the things that I did do was do a little research, and knowing that Mr. Parker's educational background, I believe that the universal pattern was a derivative or a built-up model of the medical dissection of the human anatomy. So that in the medical field, they dissect the human anatomy with the transverse plane, which is the horizontal. It dissects your height. And then they have the coronal plane, which is the dissection of depth, and they have the the sagittal plane, which is the number 3, which dissects your width. Okay, so those 3 planes are modified, so each of those is perpendicular or horizontal, 90 degrees from each other. Each is 90 degrees from the other. And then when you tip those 45 degrees up or down, they become what I reference or call a modifier of the master key plane, which is plane 1, 2, and 3 are the master key planes. If you look in Mr. Parker's book, page 169, book 4, I think it is, he shows all 9 of the planes, but he has a blank spot, and it kind of throws you off. If you move them over, then you have the 1, 2, and 3 on top, and everything else falls in below that. And so you can see that you have one, they go in 3s. You have 1, 4, 7, 2, 5, 8, and then 3, 6, and 9. And so the 1, for example, is the horizontal version or the master key plane, and then you have its diagonals. So when you're dissecting height, you can dissect it horizontally, or you can dissect it diagonally, upward or downward. And the same is true for the other 2 master key planes, number 2 and number 3.
It's funny you're referencing that, and I do have that book in front of me. And like I said, we should always use Mr. Parker's writings or teachings as our source of reference first, and then expand upon it, because that's the importance. And this is the diagrams that Mr. Durgan was explaining, and it's in Infinite Insights, looking at volume 4. And he references on page 168, he references the planes or angle. One he uses planes, and then he uses angles. What's the difference, or is there a difference there, Todd?
Well, the modifiers. So for example, number 2 plane has its modifiers. Number 2 is the dissection of your depth, right? So it runs on your sides basically. And so if you flip that 45 degrees this way or 45 degrees this way, it gives you the 5 and 8. So those angles are covered in the universal pattern. I don't teach, I personally do not utilize the analytical study of motion verbatim anymore, because they are covered in my teaching when I use the universal pattern to describe, when I use the planes to describe or define or show the student the direction, the line, the angle, and all of those things. Even the method is covered, because if it's a straight line, it's going to have anyway, I won't go into all that. So
let's get into further ado. I would like to say Derek Hibben, Richard Planas, Todd Durgan, Jamie Seabrook, Cal, Dennis Conatser, Judd Earl, Todd, I got you in there, Todd Durgan, I did there, Bob White, and everyone else that came on here. Thank you so much. Have a great night. God bless you.